What's up, beautiful people? Today we're going to take a look at the Espionage and Sedition Acts. We're going to explain them, but first, some super quick context. World War I began on July 28, 1914, and very quickly after that, President Wilson issues a declaration of neutrality, stating the U.S. has no interest in getting mixed up in this drama. In 1916, President Wilson ran for re-election largely on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." His campaign even had these swanky campaign buttons. Nevertheless, on April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to seek a declaration of war against Germany. In this declaration of war, Wilson argued it was necessary to go to war in order that the world be made safe for democracy. And remember, part of the reason the US gets into this European conflict was Wilson's call for the defense of humanitarian and democratic principles. But as big brain history people know, that wasn't the only reason. If you don't know the other reasons we got into World War I highly suggest you check out the link in the description for a video on US entry into World War I. Now remember, in the US Constitution, it is Congress that has the power to declare war, and 4 days after Wilson's speech, Congress voted to declare war, with 6 senators and 50 House members dissenting, voting against U.S. entry into the war. The reason I mention the congressional vote numbers for the declaration of war is it reveals something important about the home front during war. Anytime there is a war, not everyone in the country may be on board with the war effort. In Congress, when they voted for it, 6 senators voted against the war, and 50 congressional representatives also oppose. Fun fact time, one of the members of Congress who voted against U.S. entry in World War I was Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a lifelong pacifist who would later become the only member of either chamber of Congress to vote against declaring war against the Japanese Empire on December 8th, 1941. So homegirl said no to World War I and World War II. During World War I, there were Americans who were not exactly thrilled with the prospect of the U.S. joining the war effort. In this image, you could see a group protesting at the Capitol to U.S. entry into World War I. And while most folks supported the war effort, there were those who opposed American entry into the war. Pacifists are individuals who are opposed to all war, seeing war as immoral. Various groups, such as anarchists, socialists, thought the war was being fought to benefit capitalism and American business interest. Some women's groups found it pretty laughable. We were claiming to fight to make the world safe for democracy when democracy wasn't exactly happening for women or for most African Americans. And there were various other individuals who opposed U.S. entry into World War I. For some German immigrants in the United States, they didn't want their new country shooting up the spot where Grandpa lived. Some intellectuals and union members also opposed the war, but by and large, public opinion during World War I was generally supportive of the U.S. war effort. During the war, the U.S. government actively sought to promote nationalism, or more specifically, to get the American public to support the war effort. Not long after war was declared, President Wilson created the Committee on Public Information. CPI, as the cool kids called it on the streets, was basically a propaganda agency that sought to increase public support for the war effort. Just in case you don't know, propaganda is the spreading of information in support of a cause. Usually the dissemination of information involves a highly organized campaign, and the information may be true, or it may be highly biased or misleading or just completely false, but the point of propaganda is to influence public opinion and to further some type of agenda. During World War I, the Committee on Public Information used every type of mass communication available to mobilize public opinion behind the war effort. This included creating movies, speeches, and most famously, posters like you see right here. The point of all this propaganda was to convince the American people to do everything they could on the home front to support the war effort. The American people were encouraged to do everything from buying war bonds to conserving certain food items. In addition, another goal of the government during World War I was to restrict dissent, or rather to limit opposition to the war effort. Shortly after the U.S. entered the war, the Espionage Act of 1917 was passed, and it made it a crime for any person to convey information intended to interfere with the U.S. Armed Forces war effort. For instance, you can get yourself in a bunch of trouble if you protested the draft or encouraged men not to enlist in the military. The Sedition Act was passed in 1918. This made it a crime to say anything disloyal, profane, or abusive about the government or the war effort. Basically, the Sedition Act suppressed any speech or actions that were pro-German, anti-war, or even anti-British, because they were the US homies during World War I. These two laws applied to speech, writing, printed or published material, and any activity deemed treasonous or harmful to the war effort could lead an individual to be found guilty and subject to a fine of over $10,000 and up to 20 years in prison. In the midst of all this patriotic promotion, there was also an increase in hatred towards immigrant groups, particularly German and those who came from Austria-Hungary. Those were the people we were fighting during the war. And with nearly 2 million people living in the United States who were born in Germany, many of those individuals suffered discrimination and various other hardships such as deportation. And finally, over 1,500 people were arrested and prosecuted for violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts. So in summary, during World War I, many individuals were sent to jail for dissent against the war, foreign-born people were deported in some cases, and anti-war individuals were oftentimes seen as un-American. That's going to do it for this video. I hope I helped you out. If I did, click like, tell a friend about the channel, and as always, have a beautiful day. Peace.